Long before brands like Betty Crocker ever tested a recipe or printed a page, Southern food was already being cooked, refined, and passed down in black kitchens. Not as a trend, not as comfort, but as daily life, survival, and skill. Over time, many of those foods made their way into mainstream cookbooks. The dishes stayed familiar. The names stayed recognizable. But the people who shaped them were quietly left out of the picture. Today we're looking at 25 Southern recipes Betty Crocker didn't invent, and who deserves the credit for them. 1. Fried chicken. Fried chicken was being cooked in black Southern kitchens long before any cookbook gave it a tidy name. The method depended on judgment more than measurements, knowing how hot the skillet should feel, how the oil should shimmer, and when to turn a piece by sound instead of a clock. Seasoning wasn't timid. Cooks layered salt, pepper, and whatever else the household used, often letting the chicken rest so the flavor could settle into the meat. Cast iron did the rest, holding heat steady while the crust turned the deep brown people still recognize today. By the 1800s, black cooks in the South were already known for this method, and travelers wrote about the flavor decades before any national cookbook printed instructions. The skill was treated as common knowledge in black communities, not as something new waiting to be discovered. Versions of fried chicken later appeared in mainstream cookbooks, including Betty Crocker's, presented as cheerful, Southern-style meals for the modern table. The instructions were neater, the steps simplified, but the backbone of the dish was already decades old. What those pages never mentioned was the long line of black cooks who perfected the rhythm of it, the ones who learned by watching, not reading, and who turned a simple bird into a meal people measured every other fried chicken against. 2. Collard greens with smoked meat. Collard greens were never meant to be quick or decorative. In black households, they were cooked low and slow, usually with smoked meat that flavored both the leaves and the pot liquor beneath them. The whole kitchen smelled like that pot by mid-afternoon, a sign that supper was on its way. Cooks learned how long to simmer them by feel. Too short, and the greens stayed tough. Too long, and they lost their body. Cornbread waited on the table to soak up what was left in the bowl, because nothing in that pot was considered extra. Collards arrived in the South centuries earlier through African and Mediterranean foodways, and black cooks learned how to make them tender with long cooking and smoked meat. That method was already established before printed Southern cookbooks became popular. Mainstream cookbooks eventually offered their own versions, often lighter, less smoky, and measured out in careful teaspoons. The greens were still there, but the reason they were cooked that way rarely was. What began as nourishment shaped by black resourcefulness turned into a polite side dish on a printed page, with the hands behind it slowly fading from view. 3. Cornbread, skillet style. Cornbread didn't start sweet and fluffy. In black Southern kitchens, it was sturdy, baked in a ripping hot skillet rubbed with fat, meant to fill bellies and stretch a meal. The batter was simple: cornmeal, salt, liquid, and the cook decided the rest. The sound of it hitting the iron told you whether the pan was ready. Families expected that crisp edge and the dense middle that could be crumbled into beans or eaten with greens. It was everyday bread, not a dessert pretending to be one. When cornbread showed up in national cookbooks, the skillet sometimes disappeared, and sugar began sneaking into the bowl. The bread grew softer and sweeter, better suited to a modern idea of Southern hospitality. But the earlier version, the one black cooks relied on for generations, had already done the hard work of feeding people long before any brand claimed it as their own. Who taught you how cornbread was supposed to taste in your family? 4. Hoppin John. Hoppin John was being cooked in black communities long before it became a New Year's tradition printed in magazines. Rice and field peas were everyday foods along the low-country coast, carried forward from West African cooking and shaped by what could be grown, stored, and stretched. The combination of rice and field peas traces back to West African cooking traditions carried across the Atlantic. What looked simple on the plate held centuries of memory about how to season grains and beans together. The dish was practical first. Peas simmered until tender, rice soaked up the seasoned broth, and a little pork added depth when it was available. Families ate it on ordinary weekdays, not just on special occasions, because it was filling and dependable. Later cookbooks, including Betty Crocker editions, introduced versions called black-eyed peas with rice, often presented as a festive novelty rather than a daily staple. The measurements were exact, the steps simplified, the story trimmed away. What stayed out of those pages was how many generations of black cooks kept this meal alive through hard seasons and lean years, turning simple ingredients into something people still cook for luck today. 5. Red beans and rice. Red beans and rice didn't need a recipe card to find its way onto Southern tables. In black households, especially around Louisiana, it was Monday food, the kind of meal that could simmer while laundry boiled and the week started again. The beans cooked slow with onion, pepper, garlic, and whatever pork the cook had on hand. By evening, the pot was thick and fragrant, ladled over rice that made every spoonful go further. It was built for working families who needed one good meal to carry them through the day. Mainstream cookbooks later printed their own versions, neat and dependable, sometimes trimming the spice or shortening the cooking time to suit a different pace of life. The dish looked familiar, but the rhythm behind it changed. Long before those tidy instructions existed, black cooks had already perfected how to stretch a pound of beans into a supper that felt generous instead of small. So was this a Monday meal where you lived, or did it show up on a different day? 6. Okra and tomatoes. Okra and tomatoes were summer food in black Southern kitchens, tied to gardens and hot weather rather than grocery aisles. Okra itself came to America through the transatlantic slave trade, and black cooks were the ones who taught the South how to use it well. Pairing it with tomatoes was a way to balance texture and flavor learned long before recipe cards existed. Cooks learned how to handle okra so it softened without turning slippery, slicing it just so, pairing it with acid from ripe tomatoes, letting the mixture cook down until it tasted like August in a bowl. When the dish appeared in national cookbooks, it was often labeled simply as a vegetable side, with the seasoning toned down and the history left unmentioned. The ingredients were the same, but the voice behind them grew quieter. What those pages didn't say was that this combination had been nourishing black families for generations before anyone decided it belonged in an American collection. 7. Smothered pork chops. Smothered pork chops were born from the habit of making tough cuts tender and flavorful. In black kitchens, the chops were browned hard, then cooked down with onions and a little liquid until the meat gave up and the gravy turned silky. Nothing about the dish was fancy, but it required attention, knowing when to lower the heat, when to add a splash more broth, when the gravy had the right color. It was the kind of meal that stretched a small package of meat into a table full of plates. Smothering meats in gravy was a technique born from necessity, a way to soften tougher cuts and make them stretch further. Black cooks carried that method through Reconstruction years when good cuts were rarely available to them. Cookbook versions eventually appeared with measured cups and suggested shortcuts, presenting smothered chops as cozy home cooking with a Southern accent. The technique remained, but the reason for it, making the most of what you had, faded into the background. The flavor people loved didn't come from a brand. It came from black cooks who learned how to coax richness out of ordinary groceries. 8. Sweet potato pie. Sweet potato pie was a celebration dish in black communities long before it became a holiday icon in glossy cookbooks. Sweet potatoes were reliable crops, and turning them into a smooth, spiced filling was a way of making something beautiful from something humble. The pies were mixed by feel, a little nutmeg, a splash of milk, eggs added until the texture looked right. Every family had its own balance, and no two tables tasted exactly the same. Mainstream cookbooks, including Betty Crocker's, later offered standardized recipes with precise teaspoons and suggested shortcuts. The pies looked familiar, but the personal language of the dish was replaced by uniform directions. What didn't fit on those pages was how deeply this dessert was tied to black gatherings, church tables, and the pride of cooks who measured success by empty plates. Do you remember the first person whose pie you still measure all the others against? 9. Dirty rice. Dirty rice came out of black kitchens that believed nothing edible should ever be wasted. Cooks used small bits of meat, often chicken livers or scraps others overlooked, and folded them into rice seasoned with onion, pepper, and garlic. The color gave the dish its name, but the flavor gave it a reputation. This was everyday cooking, built from what was available after the better cuts were spoken for. Families knew how to turn those humble pieces into something rich enough to stand on its own plate. When versions of dirty rice appeared in mainstream cookbooks, the name sometimes softened and the ingredients grew milder. The dish became a polite side instead of a resourceful main meal. What never showed up in those tidy instructions was the ingenuity behind it, the way black cooks learned to make abundance out of leftovers and feed a table with pride. 10. Brunswick Stew. Brunswick stew was cooked in big pots meant to feed crowds, and black cooks were often the ones tending those kettles at gatherings, farms, and community events. The stew brought together whatever meats were on hand, corn, tomatoes, and slow heat that married everything together. No two pots tasted exactly alike. The recipe changed with the season and the cook, but the purpose stayed the same, to stretch food far enough for everyone to eat. Later cookbooks printed dependable versions with neat ingredient lists, presenting Brunswick stew as regional comfort food. The measurements looked organized, but the spirit of improvisation was trimmed away. Long before those pages were written, black cooks had already shaped this stew into a symbol of shared tables and long afternoons, stirring with spoons that never needed a timer. 11. Ham, hocks, and beans. Ham, hocks, and beans were the backbone of countless black family meals, a dish that asked only for time and patience. The beans soaked, the hocks simmered, and by evening the pot held a thick, smoky supper that could feed children and neighbors alike. This was cooking guided by sound and smell. Cooks knew when to add onion, when to mash a few beans to thicken the broth, and when the meat was ready to fall from the bone. Mainstream cookbooks later offered their own bean recipes, often lighter and quicker, but built on the same foundation. The instructions looked modern, yet the idea was generations old. What those books rarely said was how many black households depended on meals like this, turning inexpensive ingredients into comfort that felt steady instead of scarce. 12. Biscuits made with lard. And biscuits in black Southern kitchens were learned by watching hands, not reading lines of print. Lard was common, the dough handled lightly, and the goal was tenderness without fuss. Cooks judged the texture with their fingers, adding just enough liquid and folding the dough in a way that felt natural. The biscuits went into hot ovens or onto griddles, coming out ready to meet gravy, syrup, or whatever the table held. When biscuits appeared in national cookbooks, the method became precise, and the fat often changed to newer products. The results were good, but different from the biscuits shaped by memory and repetition. The pages never mentioned how many black women carried this skill from kitchen to kitchen, teaching daughters and neighbors how to make bread without ever opening a book. By the middle of the last century, American kitchens were changing fast. Companies began selling the idea that good cooking came from a clean page, neat measurements, and a friendly name on the cover. Cookbooks promised certainty. 2 teaspoons meant 2 teaspoons. A recipe became something you followed instead of something you learned by watching. But Southern food had already grown up in a different classroom. It was taught beside hot stoves, not at desks. A cook learned when the grease was ready by the way it shimmered, when the bread was done by the smell in the room, when the beans needed salt by a single spoonful tasted over the pot. When those dishes moved into mainstream cookbooks, they were trimmed to fit a format. The steps grew shorter. The seasonings grew quieter. The stories disappeared between the margins. What had been living knowledge became tidy instruction. And little by little, the idea took hold that the book came first and the cooks came later. The truth was the other way around. The food already knew where it came from, even if the pages never said it. Candied yams. Candied yams were part of black holiday tables long before marshmallows or casserole dishes entered the picture. Sliced sweet potatoes were cooked with butter, sugar, and warm spice until the syrup turned glossy and deep. The dish was celebratory, saved for Sundays and special company, and every cook had a small secret that made hers stand out. The smell alone could announce a gathering before anyone knocked on the door. Later cookbooks presented sweet potato casseroles with measured sweetness and decorative toppings, giving the dish a new costume. The flavor remained familiar, but the roots were left unnamed. What those pages did not capture was how black cooks turned a simple crop into a dessert that carried memory, church laughter, and family pride in every spoonful. 14. Fried catfish. Fried catfish was everyday food along southern rivers and back roads, cooked most often in black households that knew how to handle what the water provided. The fish was coated in seasoned cornmeal, lowered into hot oil, and fried until the crust turned crisp and golden. This was not delicate cooking. It was confident and practical, meant to feed families after long days of work. The seasoning was simple but sure, and the cook judged doneness by color and sound more than by any clock. Cookbooks later printed their own versions of Southern fried fish, usually with tidy measurements and suggested sauces. The method looked familiar, yet the life behind it was trimmed away. Long before those recipes were tested in corporate kitchens, Black cooks had already made catfish suppers a language of their own, passed from one generation to the next. 15. Cabbage cooked down with meat. Cabbage cooked with bits of pork was a quiet staple in Black Southern homes, a dish that turned a plain head of cabbage into a full meal. The leaves softened slowly with onion, pepper, and whatever smoked meat was available, filling the house with a smell that promised something good. It was the kind of food that stretched easily, tasting even better the next day. Families relied on it during lean weeks, knowing a pot of cabbage could stand beside cornbread and satisfy everyone at the table. When mainstream cookbooks offered braised cabbage recipes, the seasoning often grew lighter and the portions smaller. The dish became a side instead of the center of supper. What disappeared from the printed versions was how deeply this meal belonged to Black kitchens that learned to make ordinary vegetables feel generous. 16. Chicken and rice. Chicken and rice showed up on Black tables whenever a single bird needed to feed many mouths. The chicken simmered until tender, the rice absorbed the broth, and the pot became more than the sum of its parts. Cooks knew how to balance the flavors without measuring cups, adding onion, celery, and pepper until the smell felt right. The dish was plain in appearance but rich in comfort. Later cookbooks, including popular national ones, printed reliable chicken and rice recipes with exact steps and times. The meals looked the same on the plate, but the story behind them was left unsaid. Long before any brand wrote it down, Black families had already turned this combination into a dependable answer to the question of what was for supper. 17. Corn pone. Corn pone was older than most written recipes, a simple bread shaped by Black cooks who worked with what was on hand. The dough was mixed thick, patted into rounds, and cooked on griddles or in skillets without sugar or frills. It was meant to be sturdy, something to hold in the hand and eat alongside beans or greens. The flavor came from the corn itself and the heat of the iron, not from added sweetness. When cornbread varieties appeared in national cookbooks, the plainer pone style was often softened or replaced with lighter versions. The humble original rarely received much attention. Yet in Black households, corn pone had already earned its place as everyday bread, carrying generations of habit that never needed a printed page. Did your family call this pone, hoe cake, or something else entirely? 18. Rice pudding. Southern style. Rice pudding in Black communities was a way of turning leftover rice into a dessert that felt special. Milk, sugar, and spice were stirred together until the pot thickened and the kitchen filled with warmth. The recipe shifted from house to house, sometimes richer, sometimes simple, depending on what was available. Children waited for it to cool just enough to eat, and elders remembered who taught them to make it. Cookbooks eventually included their own versions, often dressed up with precise proportions and modern shortcuts. The pudding remained familiar, but the personal touch grew faint. What the printed directions never mentioned was how many Black cooks relied on this dish to make sure nothing went to waste while still giving their families a sweet ending. 19. Black-eyed peas. Black-eyed peas were everyday food in Black Southern homes long before they became a once-a-year tradition. The peas simmered with onion, pepper, and a bit of smoked meat, creating a pot that could sit on the stove and feed anyone who walked through the door. Families ate them with rice, with cornbread, or all by themselves, not for luck, but because they were reliable and filling. The seasoning was guided by taste, not teaspoons, and each cook had her own rhythm. Mainstream cookbooks later printed New Year versions of black-eyed peas, often turning a daily meal into a holiday custom. The pages celebrated the superstition while overlooking the ordinary life of the dish. What those books did not say was how long Black cooks had depended on these peas as steady nourishment through seasons when little else was certain. 20. Gumbo. Gumbo grew out of Black and Creole kitchens where African, Caribbean, and Southern traditions met in one pot. Okra, rue, or file thickened the broth, and whatever seafood or meat was available found its way inside. No single recipe ruled the dish. Cooks learned from mothers, aunts, and neighbors, adjusting the pot to the day and the budget. The result was always different and always familiar. The word gumbo itself comes from an African term for okra, showing how deeply the dish is tied to Black and Creole heritage. Every variation carried a piece of that older language. Cookbooks eventually offered simplified gumbos with shorter steps and lighter seasoning, making the dish easier for national audiences. The heart of it remained, but the story of who shaped it faded into the background. Long before any printed version, Black cooks had already made gumbo a language of community, spoken in bowls passed around crowded tables. 21. Pound cake. Pound cake became famous in Southern homes, but Black bakers were among the ones who carried the tradition forward and perfected it. The cake required patience, careful creaming, and an eye for texture that could not be rushed. In many Black households, the pound cake was a mark of pride, brought to church dinners and family reunions, its crumb telling everyone whether the cook knew her craft. National cookbooks later published dependable pound cake formulas, promising consistent results. The cakes were good, yet the personal heritage behind them was rarely mentioned. What never appeared in those pages was how many Black women used this cake to show love, skill, and generosity without needing a single printed instruction. 22. Peach cobbler. Peach cobbler in Black kitchens was made by feel, not by charts. Fresh or canned peaches were sweetened, spiced, and topped with biscuit dough that browned in hot ovens until the juice bubbled through. It was the dessert that ended Sunday dinners and weekday suppers alike, carried to neighbors when times were hard, and set on church tables when times were good. Cookbooks later standardized cobbler with neat measurements and shortcuts, presenting it as classic Southern comfort. The result looked the same, but the hands behind it were invisible. Before any brand claimed the recipe, Black cooks had already made peach cobbler a symbol of welcome, teaching the next generation by letting them stir the bowl. 23. Neck bones and gravy. Neck bones and gravy were born from the necessity of using every part of the animal. Black cooks simmered the bones until the meat softened and the broth turned rich enough to pour over rice or potatoes. This was humble food that tasted anything but poor. The gravy carried the flavor, and the bones gave up everything they had to families who needed it. Mainstream cookbooks rarely named this dish directly, though similar techniques appeared under more polite titles. The flavor was borrowed while the name was left behind. What mattered was that Black kitchens had already turned these overlooked cuts into meals that held families together when better options were out of reach. 24. Banana pudding. Banana pudding in Black communities was built from cooked custard and real patience. Layers of wafers and bananas softened together until the flavors blended into something gentle and comforting. The dessert showed up at picnics, church anniversaries, and summer evenings, each cook convinced her version was the best. No box mix could replace the feeling of stirring the custard on the stove. Cookbooks later offered quick versions with shortcuts and instant fillings, making the dish faster but different in spirit. The bowl looked familiar, yet the story of who kept it alive was missing. Long before those printed variations, Black cooks had already made banana pudding a language of celebration and care. Wafers and bananas became common in the early 1900s, but Black cooks were the ones who turned them into the layered custard dessert now called classic Southern. 25. Beans and rice. Simple supper. Beans and rice in their plainest form were the backbone of countless Black meals, a pairing that crossed regions and generations. The beans simmered with whatever seasoning was available. The rice stretched the pot further, and everyone ate. This was not company food, but daily survival food, teaching children that a simple plate could still be a good one. The recipe changed with the cupboard, but the idea never did. Later cookbooks presented similar combinations as economical home cooking, tidy and measured. The dishes appeared new to readers who did not know their deeper roots. What those pages could not capture was how many Black families had already relied on beans and rice to carry them through ordinary days, shaping a tradition that no brand ever invented. Behind almost every familiar Southern dish is a line of Black cooks who kept it alive, improved it, and fed their families with it. The food we know is their work, whether the credit was printed or not. These meals were shaped in real kitchens, by people who cooked because somebody was hungry, because a child needed supper, because a church hall needed feeding, because another day had to be met. The recipes moved from hand to hand long before they moved from page to page in an illustrated cookbook with a brand name on it. Cookbooks eventually wrote the story down, but the knowledge was already finished and perfected. It lived in the way a skillet sounded, the way a pot smelled, the way a cook knew something was ready without looking at a clock. Southern cooking did not begin in print. It began with black cooks who turned what they had into what we still love. And every time these dishes are made, that history is still sitting at the table with us.